Hey guys, tonight we step back into an age when the world was silent, buried beneath endless snow and ice. A time when survival itself was a story whispered through the wind, when ancient hunters walked across frozen continents, chasing life through a world that seemed determined to end it. For centuries, their world was a mystery, how they endured the cold, how they kept the fire alive, how they slept beneath the ice when the sun disappeared for months. But slowly, piece by piece, science has begun to uncover the quiet secrets of their frozen lives, and what it reveals is far stranger and more haunting than anyone ever imagined. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's drift together into the frozen silence of the Ice Age. It begins with silence, not the kind of silence we know today, where somewhere in the distance a machine hums or a faint echo of life breaks through the air, but a silence so absolute that even the sound of your own breath feels too loud. The Ice Age stretched endlessly before them, a world locked in stillness. The sun was a pale disk, dimmed by frozen clouds that drifted like sleep over the horizon. The land was white, endless and cold, a silence that swallowed everything. Across this frozen expanse, small figures moved, fragile and quiet, like ghosts wandering through a dream of frost. These were the ancient hunters, the first to stand between life and the cold. Their world was not divided by comfort or civilization. It was defined only by endurance. They did not hurry. They rarely spoke. Each movement was careful, measured, as if the air itself could shatter if disturbed. At night, the cold deepened into something living. It pressed against their shelters, slipped through animal hides, and crept beneath their skin. The stars above were sharp and unmoving, scattered like shards of broken ice. Sometimes, the hunters would look up and imagine they could hear them crackling, far away as if the heavens themselves were frozen. There were no roads, no smoke in the distance to promise warmth, only vast plains of frozen soil, cracked rivers, and the long shadows of glaciers that moved slower than time itself. Each step they took left behind a fragile trace, footprints in the snow that would soon vanish under drifting ice. Yet, somehow, some of those footprints did not vanish. They remained, hidden under layers of frost for tens of thousands of years, preserved like memories waiting to be found. One such trail, discovered not long ago, puzzled even the scientists who found it. Bare human footprints. A child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, walking barefoot across frozen ground. No shoes, no animal skins, just the clear shape of toes pressed into the cold earth and the faint trace of an adult walking beside them. Where were they going? Why were they barefoot in a world where even a few minutes of exposure could mean death? No one knows. But sometimes, when the wind moves over the tundra in certain places, it sounds just faintly like a child's laughter, echoing from nowhere. The Ice Age did not care for comfort. It was patient, ancient, indifferent. Snow fell in slow spirals that never seemed to end. It piled against the bones of mammoths and covered the faces of the hunters as they slept. Each morning, they woke to the same grey light, the same endless wind, the same task to endure another day. They learned to read the ice the way we read words. They saw cracks and patterns that told them where to walk, where to dig, where the wind would shift next. To them, the world was not empty. It was alive, whispering through soundless things. Their fires burned low and smoky. Flames were rare treasures, and each spark had to be earned. The hunters carried glowing embers inside hollow bones, wrapped in dried moss, keeping them alive for the next shelter. Imagine the sight, a flicker of orange light trembling in a sea of white, a fragile heartbeat in a frozen world. It wasn't warmth that kept them alive, it was faith, faith that the light would survive the night. There were no calendars, no hours, only cycles of light and dark, winter and deeper winter. They measured time in hunger, in the melting of snow on their fingers, in the sound of wind against stone. When storms came, they did not fight them. They lay still, listening to the sky roar. To resist the cold was foolish, to accept it was survival. Sometimes, strange shapes appeared in the snow, tall, shimmering figures seen only from the corner of one's eye. The hunters believed they were the shadows of the mountains, or perhaps the ghosts of those who had frozen long ago. These shapes would vanish when approached, leaving behind only still air and faint warmth, as if something had just been there. We now call them mirages, tricks of light and temperature, but perhaps the hunters were not entirely wrong. The ice remembers. The air carries memory in ways we cannot see. Deep in certain valleys, the cold preserved things with eerie precision, entire moments trapped in frost a hand reaching, a broken spear, a cluster of seeds still clutched in frozen fingers. The air there feels different, heavier, as if every breath carries a trace of someone who once lived and waited in the same stillness. When night came, the world did not darken, it deepened. The moonlight spread across the plains like milk poured over glass. Shadows didn't move. They simply existed, as ancient as the cold itself. In the distance, the low groan of shifting ice sometimes echoed for miles, the earth itself stretching in its sleep. The hunters heard it often and grew used to it, though one elder used to say that it was not the ice that groaned, but the memory of the world trying to wake. The people of the ice were few. They knew one another by name, but also by silence. They shared food wordlessly, slept close for warmth, and told stories not with voices, but with slow gestures by the firelight. Their stories were not about heroes or battles, they were about the sky, the cold, and the strange things that sometimes moved through the snow when everyone was asleep. They spoke, for example, of the one who walks ahead, a figure said to appear on the horizon before great storms, tall, faceless, always walking north. Sometimes, hunters claimed to find footprints that began in the middle of nowhere and ended at the mouth of a cave. Perhaps it was a warning, or perhaps just another story to keep fear company in the long nights. But deep down, even the skeptics felt uneasy when the northern winds began to howl as if something unseen still wandered just beyond the edge of the firelight. When dawn came, it was not bright. The sun rose like a pale ghost, barely lifting the frost from their hair. They would rise slowly, stretch stiff limbs, and begin again. The same steps, the same snow, the same silent determination. Every small act, lighting a spark, wrapping a child in furs, carving a tool from bone, was a kind of victory, a whisper against the impossible. And so the days passed, measured in frost and breath. Generations lived and died in that whiteness, leaving behind nothing but the faintest of traces. And yet, we find those traces still bones under ice, tools in frozen rivers, footprints leading nowhere. Each discovery is like hearing a whisper from the past, a voice carried across 10,000 winters, saying, "We were here, we endured." The silence returns. The wind sighs over the frozen plains, just as it did then, and if you listen closely enough, really listen, you might almost hear it. The faint rhythm of footsteps across ancient snow, fading, but never quite gone. Fire was not merely a discovery, it was a memory, carried through time, a quiet agreement between humankind and the world that refused to kill them. In the frozen dark of the Ice Age, fire was not a tool, it was a presence, something alive, something with a voice that whispered and crackled in the stillness. It was the only thing that moved when everything else stood frozen. The first fires were never bright. They flickered like shy thoughts, struggling against the wind. The hunters gathered around them, not speaking, only watching. The flames reflected in their eyes, small and trembling, as though each person was seeing something sacred. There was no word for comfort then. There was only warmth, brief, fragile, almost holy. They learned to feed it slowly, to protect it, like a sleeping child. The flames did not belong to them. They belonged to the world, and could turn away at any moment. The hunters believed that if you angered the fire, it would remember and refuse to light again. Somewhere in those early years, among the caves and the endless snow, a strange story began to form, the story of the eternal ember. They said there was once a fire that had never died. Its first spark had been born from lightning that struck a frozen plain. The hunters who found it guarded it with devotion. For generations they kept it alive, feeding it with resin, moss, and breath. They carried its glowing coal in hollow bones when they travelled. It was never allowed to go out, even when the storms came, even when people starved. They said the ember contained something more than heat. It remembered every hand that had ever warmed itself beside it. Archaeologists today have found traces of charred material sealed in ancient bones, remnants of what might have been carried coals. No one can prove the legend, but when you see that blackened hollow, the shape of a spark long gone, it's hard not to imagine that story might be true. At night, fire changed the shape of the world. The ice turned gold. Shadows flickered across cave walls, moving like silent animals. The hunters' faces glowed with faint orange light, and the breath rising from their lips shimmered like smoke. The smell of burning wood mixed with the scent of wet fur, and the quiet rhythm of the flames became the heartbeat of their existence. The sound of fire was hypnotic. It drew thoughts out of silence, like a song half remembered from a dream. Sometimes they spoke to it not out of superstition, but because in the vast, indifferent night, it was the only thing that listened. When a flame trembled suddenly, they said the fire was answering. When sparks rose, they said it was breathing. Fire taught them patience. It could not be rushed. It needed time, care, attention. In that slowness, they began to understand rhythm, the rhythm of wind, the rhythm of hunger, the rhythm of existence itself. And perhaps that is where the first stories were born, not from voices, but from flames moving on cave walls. Shadows of mammoths, hunters, and spirits played across the stone. They did not yet paint these things. They watched them dance in the firelight. Somewhere in a cave deep in France, archaeologists found black soot stains on the ceiling too high to be from a normal campfire. It suggests the people built fires large enough to fill the space with shadow shows, or to light carvings that are still faintly visible on the walls. What were they doing? Were they creating art, or remembering something? Perhaps both. Perhaps the first stories we ever told were told to the fire itself. There is another mystery, a peculiar kind of ash, found preserved near mammoth bone huts in Eastern Europe. When examined under microscopes, it showed traces of plants that do not burn easily. Some think it was an early form of incense herbs chosen not for warmth, but for scent. The hunters may have burned them to keep away insects, or maybe they simply liked the way the smoke curled differently, how it changed the air. Even in the depths of the Ice Age, they were drawn to small beauty, the perfume of burning leaves in a frozen night. As centuries passed, fire became something communal, the center of life. Every evening, small groups gathered around it to mend furs, sharpen bones, whisper stories, or simply to sit in silence. Sometimes, during the longest winters, they would stay awake together, listening to the sounds beyond the light, the low hum of the wind, the distant crack of ice shifting. They said that if you stared into the flames long enough, you could see faces appear, not of the living, but of those who had gone before. The fire was their messenger, carrying warmth between worlds. Modern science tells us that when we look at fire, our eyes relax into slow movements, similar to the rhythms of sleep. It calms the brain. It makes time disappear. Perhaps our ancestors already knew this, without needing to name it. Perhaps they stared into those flames not to dream, but to stay awake inside the dream of the world. In the deep hours of the night, when the wind's voice grew low, some of them would step outside, leaving the circle of light behind. The stars above were clearer then, untouched by cloud or warmth. From a distance, the fire looked like a single heartbeat glowing in an ocean of dark. Sometimes they would see another glow far away, another clan, another hearth, and they would feel less alone. Between those two fires stretched miles of frozen silence. Yet in that silence, something invisible connected them. The knowledge that someone else, somewhere, was awake too, guarding their flame against the same unending cold. In certain places, where ancient fires once burned, the soil still holds chemical traces, blackened rings of ash hidden under grass. When you stand there, even now, the ground feels slightly warmer, not in temperature, but in memory. It's as if the earth itself remembers being close to the flame. One excavation in Siberia revealed something stranger, a line of burned circles leading across the tundra, not in a camp, but a trail. Dozens of them, almost evenly spaced. It looked as though someone had carried a small fire and stopped to rest, again and again, over many miles. No bones, no tools, only the remains of fire. Whoever it was, they had been alone. Perhaps they were following something. Perhaps they were lost. But the path of ashes seemed deliberate, as if they were marking the darkness itself, leaving breadcrumbs of warmth through an endless night. The last fire in that line was larger, ringed with stones. It had burned longer than the others. Beside it, a small shard of obsidian, a tool, or maybe just a piece, a kind of glass kept for its shine. The archaeologist could not say what happened to the one who made that trail, but sometimes I wonder if that person was simply walking home, home being wherever the fire still lived. Fire gave the hunters a sense of time. The flicker of the flame, the falling of embers, the dying of coals, these were their hours and minutes. When the last glow faded, morning was not far behind. And so the cycle continued. Light, dark, flame, ash. Even now, when we light candles or sit before a fireplace in the quiet of winter, something ancient stirs in us. A memory deeper than thought. A sense that this small light is not just for warmth, it is for belonging. It reminds us that once, long ago, we too sat in the frozen dark, surrounded by silence, and made our own sun from a spark. And maybe, somewhere beneath the permafrost, the eternal ember still sleeps a coal that has never gone out, waiting for someone to breathe on it again. When the wind moves just right across the tundra, a faint warmth seems to rise from the ground. Perhaps it's only the air, or perhaps, far beneath the snow, the fire still remembers. Beneath the endless white, where the wind no longer screamed, and the air grew still as a sleeping breath, the hunters built their shelters. They did not build them times upon times the land, but times within times it. The snow, the ice, the earth itself, these became their walls. To survive, they learned to disappear. The Ice Age world was vast and cruel, but also strangely quiet. Everything that lived in it, mammoths, wolves, men, seemed to move in slow rhythm with the cold. The sky itself looked frozen, heavy with pale light. There were no trees in most of the land, no wood for walls, no stones that could keep out the wind. So the people turned to what they had: bones, hides, snow. Archaeologists call them mammoth bone dwellings. The phrase sounds clinical, almost sterile, but to imagine them as they truly were, that takes a certain stillness of mind. A clearing, half buried in frost. A circle of enormous bones, ribs taller than a man, curved like arches of a cathedral. Between them, thick hide stretched tight. Then covered in snow, which froze solid, and sealed every gap. Inside, the space glowed faintly from firelight, warm breath collecting on the ceiling like mist. The bones creaked sometimes, as if remembering the animal they once were. When the wind passed over them, the sound was like a sigh. Some people said the bones were still alive, dreaming quietly in their second life, protecting those who once hunted them. Inside those shelters, time slowed. The fire crackled softly. The smell of fat and smoke filled the small space. Shadows played across the curved walls of ivory and fur. They slept close together, families, hunters, elders, the heat of their bodies the most precious thing they owned. In the mornings, frost would bloom on their hair. In the nights, the wind would sing above, muffled by the snow roof, like a lullaby from the storm itself. There was a rhythm to their days: collect ice for water, fetch bones from the mammoth graveyard, patch the hides, feed the fire. Every action was a kind of prayer, and in that quiet rhythm, something extraordinary happened. They began to decorate the inside of their shelters. Yes, the people of the ice built homes not only to survive, but to make them beautiful. Charcoal drawings, red ochre patterns, strange marks spiraling like thought. Some of these markings still survive, faint and incomplete, as if time itself had hesitated to erase them. What did they mean? No one knows. Perhaps they were maps, perhaps they were memories of hunts, of faces, of dreams, or perhaps they were simply what humans always do: fill silence with symbols, turn the cold into meaning. In one excavation near Mesurich, archaeologists found small holes carved into mammoth skulls too deliberate to be random. Through these holes, light from the fire would shine, forming points of brightness across the interior, like a tiny constellation on the walls. It is tempting to think they recreated the night sky inside their shelter, a private universe carved from bone. It is a quiet thought, the Ice Age hunter lying beside a dying fire, staring at little dots of firelight on the wall, remembering the stars hidden by snow. Perhaps that was their first form of dreaming. And sometimes they built tunnels, small, narrow corridors connecting one shelter to another. The ground above them was so thick with frost that it sealed everything in, making these tunnels dark and still. Inside, the air stayed warmer, the smoke drifted slowly, and every sound felt amplified: the breath, the crackle, the soft tread of bare feet on frozen dirt. Some scholars believe these passages were practical protection from predators or from the wind, but others have noticed something strange. The tunnels were often curved, looping gently, even when a straight path would have been easier. No one knows why. Some think the people built them that way on purpose, perhaps believing that spirits could only travel in straight lines, and a curved tunnel would keep them from entering. If that's true, then their homes were both shelter and sanctuary, shaped not only for warmth, but for safety from the unseen. There are also signs of sound. Inside one of the bone huts, scientists discovered that when you whisper near the walls, the echoes shimmer softly, like the sound is absorbed and reflected at once. It's possible that the people discovered this too, that the bones changed the way the air spoke, and perhaps that's why they sang. Yes, they might have sung. Not songs as we know them, but long, low tones, hums that blended with the sound of the fire. If you sit alone in the snow today and hum softly into the cold, you can feel the vibration of your voice travel through the ground, almost like a pulse. Maybe they felt that too. Maybe they sang to the bones, and the bones sang back. Even now, the remnants of these shelters remain hidden beneath layers of earth and ice. When researchers uncover them, they find small details that feel almost tender: beads carved from ivory, carefully stacked stones, traces of ochre fingerprints on the walls. It's strange to think that in a time when survival was everything, someone still had time to leave a mark of beauty, that even in the middle of an endless winter, they wanted to make the cold feel like home. Sometimes, I imagine one of those nights, a single shelter buried in snow, the wind whispering outside. Inside, the fire is low. A child is tracing a finger over the lines on a bone, following its curve, not knowing that thousands of years later, someone else would do the same. The elder beside the fire breathes softly, their face half lit, half shadow. They might be humming. The air smells faintly of ash and hide, of something cooked long ago. And beyond the walls, the frozen world listens. When spring finally came, a word that meant something different, then the people would step outside and find the snow melting away from their shelter. The white world opened like a slow dawn. Streams began to murmur again, small and silver, trickling between bones. Birds returned, and the shelter that had kept them alive would begin to sink, melting into the ground, its bones softening, its memory fading. But they always built another, always beneath the wind, always half hidden, as if the earth itself were teaching them humility to live quietly, not to stand against the world, but within it. There is one mystery that still lingers. In several Ice Age sites, deep beneath layers of frost, archaeologists have found large stones arranged carefully in circles, each one blackened by fire, but no trace of bones or tools nearby. Some think these were gathering places, or perhaps shelters that melted away completely. But others suggest something stranger, that they were places of listening. If you crouch there, even today, when the wind dies and the snow muffles the world, you can hear the faintest sound like water moving beneath ice, or the echo of a fire long gone. It isn't real, not exactly, but once you hear it, it's hard to forget. Maybe that's what the Ice Age shelters were. Not just homes, but memories. Places where the world and the people spoke to each other, quietly, in warmth and breath. Each shelter built from bones that once moved, covered by hides that once felt the wind, sealed by snow that once fell from the sky. Everything connected, everything borrowed, everything returned. And when they left, when the ice shifted, and the seasons pulled them onward, they never looked back. They knew the shelter would crumble, the snow would swallow it, the bones would sink, but they also knew that somewhere deep beneath the frost, the warmth would remain a trace of breath, a whisper of fire, a shape in the earth that still remembers the sound of human sleep. The hunt in the frozen world was not fast. It was not fierce, nor filled with shouts and rushes of triumph. It was slow, almost silent, like everything else in the Ice Age. When the hunters walked across the snow, they did not disturb it. Their feet pressed down softly, leaving faint hollows that the wind soon erased. Their bodies were wrapped in furs so thick they seemed like moving shadows, fragments of the landscape itself. Every step was measured, every breath deliberate, so that even the frost in their lungs would not betray them. The world they hunted in was endless. The whiteness stretched until it merged with the sky. There were no paths, no tracks to follow that did not fade within hours. The Imaya and horizon gave nothing away. They relied on memory, on stories, on marks carved into bones or stones. Quiet maps whispered from one generation to the next. A single ridge meant water. A cluster of black stones meant the path of reindeer. But most of the hunt was learned through silence, by watching, by listening, by waiting. They called it the long patience. It was not a skill, but a state of being. To hunt in the Ice Age meant to vanish, to slow your heart, your breath, your thoughts, until the animals no longer sensed you as different from the land itself. There were times when they would wait for days, lying beneath snowdrifts, wrapped in furs, motionless, eyes barely open. The world above would continue as if they did not exist, herds moving slowly across the white plains, their breath forming clouds in the air, their hooves muffled by frost. The hunters would feel the vibrations through the ground before they saw anything, the faint tremor of distant movement, like the heartbeat of the earth. Sometimes they used the wind. If the air moved in their favor, they could inch closer, their scent carried away into the cold. But if the wind turned, all was lost. The herd would scatter long before they stood. They had learned to read the smallest signs, the tilt of snowflakes, the way smoke drifted from a fire, even the sound of their own breath in the air. There are ancient drawings that show men kneeling with long, thin spears, but the truth was gentler than that. They rarely ran, they rarely shouted. They did not chase their prey, they times followed, times it. For hours, sometimes days, they moved in the same rhythm as the herd, keeping distance, never forcing. The hunt was a slow conversation between hunger and patience, and there is something quietly strange in this. The hunters of the Ice Age often did not kill the first animal they could. In some discovered sites, carcasses show signs of ritual, delay marks that suggest the hunters waited before striking, as if seeking permission, a pause before the final act, a stillness before the life ended. It's hard to imagine now, but to them, the animal was not only food, it was a spirit that gave itself, a being to be treated with the same silence they used to approach it. After a kill, they would touch the animal's head, whisper something that has long since vanished from all languages, maybe gratitude, maybe apology, maybe both. At night, when they returned from a successful hunt, they did not celebrate loudly. There was no victory in survival, only continuation. The fire would burn quietly, the meat would be divided without speech. The hide stretched and prepared, the bones cleaned. They worked in rhythm with the crackle of firewood, with the steady breathing of those who rested. Some say the hunters could sense when an animal was near, even before seeing it. Modern researchers might call it intuition, but the Ice Age people spoke of something else, a kind of knowing that came from deep stillness. They believed the earth whispered if you listened long enough, that the snow carried the footsteps of creatures in its sound, that the air itself could tell you which way the herds had gone. There are rare accounts carved on bones and cave walls of hunters following trails that no one else could see. Lines etched in the shape of spirals, loops, circles, almost like the paths of wind. Some believe these were maps of movement, not land, not where the prey times was asterisk, but how it times moved asterisk. Patterns of migration that only the patient could understand. And among those patterns, one mystery stands out. In several regions, bones of mammoths were found arranged in strange formations, not hunting traps, not shelters. Circles and arcs, some extending for meters, always facing east. It is unclear whether these were markers of past hunts, or perhaps places where the hunters waited, quietly, for something to return. Imagine that. A group of silent figures standing in the pale morning light, the frost glowing gold around them, the bones of giants rising from the snow like monuments. They stand there, motionless, as if in prayer. Perhaps the mammoths passed that way once each season, and the hunters waited, knowing they might never come again. Perhaps those circles were offerings to memory, to the world that provided and then withdrew. In this frozen stillness, the hunt was never only about food. It was about belonging, understanding one's place in the endless chain of need and giving. The Ice Age hunter did not conquer nature. He became part of its slow rhythm. In the frozen north, there is a legend, or rather, a whisper passed through generations, about the time's silent hunt asterisk. It tells of a night so cold that the air itself stopped moving. The hunters left their shelter, following no tracks, guided only by a feeling. They walked across the white plain until they reached a place where even their own footsteps made no sound. There, in the silence, they saw something vast in the distance, not a mammoth, not a beast, but a shimmer in the air, as if the cold had taken a shape. The story says they stood still until morning, waiting for it to move. It never did. When they returned, they said the world had stopped breathing for a moment. That night, their fire burned blue, and no one spoke. No one knows what the story means. Perhaps it was just a tale of the strange lights that danced above the Ice Age skies, the auroras that flickered like spirits. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a way of explaining what it felt like to hunt not just for food, but for meaning, for presence, for life itself, amid the frozen silence. When you think of the slow hunt, you might imagine struggle, danger, exhaustion. But for them, it was something softer. It was meditation, a merging of body and world. The Ice Age hunter moved through snow not as an intruder, but as part of the same frozen rhythm that kept everything alive. And even now, when you stand in the quiet of a snowy forest, if you breathe slowly enough, you can almost sense it, that ancient patience. The air carries it still, like a faint memory of footsteps moving across the frost, in perfect silence, towards something unseen but deeply known. It is the same silence that lingers beneath the snow, beneath time itself, the slow hunt that never really ended. Hunger, in the frozen world, was not an enemy. It was a companion, quiet, persistent, always walking beside them. It never shouted, never raged. It whispered, like the wind moving through bone. The Ice Age hunter knew its voice well. It began softly in the morning, like an echo deep within the body, a small hollow sound that reminded them how far they were from the last meal. As the day went on, it grew louder, not in noise, but in presence. It filled their thoughts, blurred the edges of the world, and made even the snow seem to breathe differently. In that endless winter, food was not guaranteed. Sometimes the hunt failed. Sometimes the herds vanished for weeks, following paths only they could know. Then the fires burned low, and the air inside the shelters grew thin with the scent of smoke and nothing else. What does hunger sound like? Not the rumble of an empty stomach, but something deeper, a rhythm that seeps into the bones. When the body is starved, the heart slows, the breath deepens, and every small sound a crack of wood, the sigh of wind becomes louder, sharper, more meaningful. It is as if the world begins to speak through absence. There were nights when the hunters would sit in silence, staring at the dim embers, each lost in their own quiet battle. The children would sleep, thin and still, their dreams heavy with smoke. And the elders would tell stories not to entertain, but to fill the space where food should have been. They spoke of hunts that never ended, of beasts that could not die, of the stars themselves as glowing fires of ancient prey. Sometimes they chewed on hides, softened with water and ash, just to trick the body into remembering the act of eating. Sometimes they boiled bones again and again, pulling out the last thread of marrow until the water turned grey. And when that too was gone, they listened. There is an old belief among northern tribes passed down quietly, never written, that hunger makes you hear things others cannot. Not hallucinations, but memories of the earth itself. They said that when the stomach was empty long enough, it opened another sense, one that could hear the sound beneath silence. Archaeologists sometimes find objects from that time, small stones with holes drilled clean through, worn smooth from use. Some believe these were pendants or tools, but others, especially the old ethnographers, think differently. They think these stones were meant to be times listened through. Asterisk. When held to the ear, the wind would hum through them, producing a faint, haunting tone, a single, trembling note that changed with every gust. The people may have believed it was the voice of hunger itself, a reminder that they were still alive, still waiting. It's not hard to imagine a figure crouched beside a fading fire, holding a small bone or stone to their ear, listening to the wind sing through it. The sound is thin but constant, like a distant flute or the breathing of the land. In that moment, hunger becomes not pain, but presence, a signal that the world still moves, that something out there still breathes with them. The body, when empty, begins to change its rhythm. Movement slows, the senses sharpen, time stretches. Each flake of snow, each shadow on the wall seems to have its own voice. There are written accounts from much later, when Arctic explorers described the same strange calm, the point at which hunger stops hurting and becomes a quiet clarity. Perhaps the Ice Age hunters reached that point too. They learned to recognize it, that stillness between weakness and surrender. It was said that the elders could tell, just by looking into someone's eyes, when hunger had changed them, not death, not despair, but a kind of gentleness, the body accepting its own fading, as softly as snow falling on fur. And yet, even in this softness, they endured. The women would gather ice moss, roots frozen deep, scraps of meat hidden from the last hunt. The men would return to the fields of bones, breaking the frost open to search for marrow or traces of fat. The world gave little, but they never stopped asking. There is one haunting discovery from an Ice Age camp, a circle of stones with nothing inside it, except a single piece of burned bone. The scientists who studied it found something strange, traces of human fat in the ash. They debated endlessly, was it accidental or deliberate, a tragedy or a ritual? No one knows, but some whisper that, in the deepest cold, when even fire could no longer comfort them, the people turned to something unspeakable. If that is true, it was not cruelty or madness, it was desperation turned into reverence. They believed that nothing truly ended, that life could be carried forward, reshaped, renewed, and perhaps, in that last act, they were still listening to the sound of hunger still answering its call. Even as it consumed them, hunger did not always mean despair. It also meant awareness of time, of breath, of fragility. When you have nothing left to eat, you begin to taste the world itself. The air has flavor, the snow has weight. Even silence becomes full, almost nourishing. In this way, hunger shaped the mind. It taught patience that no comfort could teach. It taught stillness that no abundance could sustain. Perhaps that is why the people of the ice rarely hoarded or wasted. They had lived too long beside emptiness to ever forget its lessons. And sometimes, when the hunger grew unbearable, they sang. Not loudly, but quietly. Almost under their breath, humming to keep the air warm inside their mouths. These were not songs of hope or prayer. They were songs of endurance, of rhythm, of keeping time. Each note measured another heartbeat, another moment survived. Some of these melodies, passed down through countless winters, may still exist hidden in the ancient lullabies of northern people. Slow, wordless tunes that rise and fall like breathing, that carry the memory of empty nights and patient fires. If you listen to them closely, you can almost hear the echo of those first voices humming against the cold, refusing to vanish. In one excavation, archaeologists found a flute made from a bird bone, tiny holes, precisely carved. When they reconstructed it, the sound that emerged was strange, not cheerful, not sad, but hauntingly empty. It seemed to drift rather than play, like wind searching for something it could not find. Some scientists called it music, others said it was mimicry, an attempt to echo the cries of distant animals, but perhaps it was something simpler, an attempt to make the hunger sing. Imagine that night. A group of hunters huddled inside a shelter, a faint blue flame flickering in the center, the air thick with cold. One of them raises a bone flute to their lips. The sound that emerges is almost nothing a breath caught in frost. It floats upward, merges with the wind leaking through the cracks, and disappears. No one speaks, no one claps, but in that fragile sound they find a kind of peace. To be hungry in the Ice Age was not a condition, it was a rhythm of life. a reminder that everything must be taken slowly, that warmth, food, and survival were not possessions but moments. And when those moments passed, what remained was stillness and the soft sound beneath silence that only hunger could reveal. When the storms ended and the herds returned and the fires grew strong again, they never forgot that sound. Even in plenty, they could still hear it faintly, like a heartbeat under the snow. The sound of hunger, patient, endless, and strangely beautiful. The world of ice was no place for the fragile, and yet, in its frozen heart, the first small voices of humanity, the children still echoed softly through the white silence. They were not born into warmth, nor into comfort, but into the kind of cold that pressed against the soul and made every breath feel like borrowed time. Still, they laughed, in small bursts, muffled beneath furs and drifting snow. They played with sticks that froze to their mittens and learned to walk on ground that had never known softness. The children of the cold were fragile, but they were also a quiet promise, proof that even the Ice Age could not stop life from continuing. One small heartbeat at a time, in the flickering light of a low fire, a woman wrapped a newborn in the hide of a hare. The fur was thin, hardly enough to keep the child warm, but it was all they had. Outside, the wind roared like an endless beast, dragging snow across the ground in long sweeping ribbons. The mother's hands trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. For hours she had pressed the child close to her chest, feeling the tiny pulse beneath her skin. Around her, the others sat in silence, the elders, the hunters, the few who had survived another week of hunger. They watched her with quiet reverence, as though witnessing something sacred. The baby's soft breath was the only sound that broke the stillness, faint and uneven, but alive. In that breath was the memory of 1,000 ancestors who had endured this same cold, in caves and forests long since buried under ice. Children were rare in those frozen centuries. Many never lived to see the thaw of their first spring, yet when they did, their presence was a kind of warmth that no fire could equal. Hunters would smile at their cries, mothers would hum old songs in languages long forgotten, and the tribe would move with new purpose. The young reminded them that survival was not merely a habit, it was a duty, passed down from one shivering generation to the next. Sometimes, when the blizzards grew cruel and food ran out, it was the laughter of a child that pulled an old man back from despair. There is something almost haunting about how children adapted to the cold. Archaeologists, in their quiet work among bones and stones, have found tiny handprints pressed into ancient clay, evidence that even in the midst of an ice age, children were learning, shaping, creating. Some of those prints were found near the charred remains of ancient fires, as though the young had played near the warmth, fascinated by its flicker. A few prints were small enough to belong to a child barely 2 years old. It's strange to think of that, a tiny human, living among mammoths and saber-toothed predators, leaving behind a mark that would survive for tens of thousands of years. The adults hunted to live, but the children left echoes. There were no toys, no carved figures or painted walls for amusement, not yet. Their games were born of necessity. They learned to crawl through snow tunnels, mimicking how hunters stalked prey. They practiced throwing sticks, learning balance before strength. They listened, with wide eyes, to stories whispered around the fire, tales of animals that could vanish into blizzards and spirits that lived beneath the ice. Some stories were warnings, others, perhaps, were a way to make sense of the endless cold. One tale, passed through generations, spoke of a white mother, a spirit who carried sleeping children through the snow, keeping them safe until morning. It may have been myth, or it may have been a memory of mothers who walked into the storm, carrying their children, never to return. What's remarkable is how these children endured a world that would have easily crushed them. Their bodies adapted subtly, shorter limbs, broader chests, layers of fat that helped preserve warmth. Their instincts sharpened early. They could sense the coming of a storm before the adults could see the clouds. They knew how to find warmth in the crook of an animal's fur, or how to press against each other under hides to share heat. These were lessons learned not from teaching, but from instinct, the quiet knowledge that to be still was to survive. And yet, the Ice Age was not merciful. Many nights, families buried the smallest among them, their tiny forms wrapped in furs and placed under stones to keep scavengers away. The ground was too hard to dig, so they built cairns, silent mounds that the wind would soon cover. Each burial was a ritual, done with care and resignation. The dead were not spoken of much. Grief was a luxury few could afford. But sometimes, after long nights of snow and silence, the mothers would whisper lullabies into the frozen air, as if the lost children still lingered, carried by the wind that never slept. Some evidence suggests that the tribes of the far north made small amulets for their young teeth of wolves or birds, carved smooth and strung with sinew. These weren't decorations, they were meant to protect the children, to ward off illness or misfortune. In many burials, such charms are found beside the small remains. The belief that something unseen guarded them was not foolishness, but hope, the same kind of fragile faith that still lives within us today, when we whisper to the dark and hope it listens kindly. There's one particular discovery that has puzzled archaeologists for years. A child's footprint found deep inside a cave system, in France, preserved in soft clay beside the paw marks of a wolf. The two sets of prints move side by side, unbroken, as if the child and the animal had walked together in silence. No signs of struggle, no signs of fear, just quiet companionship through the dark. Some believe the wolf was tamed, a rare early sign of what would later become the bond between man and dog. Others think it was simply chance that a wolf had passed after the child. But somehow, the story feels older than either explanation. It speaks to a kind of mystery that science can't quite measure, a glimpse of something shared between species. Born in the cold, children grew up fast in those ages. By the time they could walk, they were already part of the struggle, gathering kindling, carrying hides, mimicking their elders. By 12, they were hunters themselves, or close to it. Childhood was short, but it was enough. In their brief years of innocence, they absorbed the wisdom of survival not from words, but from watching how the world behaved. The colour of the sky before snow, the crack of distant ice, the way breath froze faster on certain mornings, these became their alphabet, their language of endurance. When spring finally came, brief and muddy, the children of the cold would run across the melting ground, their laughter ringing like something ancient and new all at once. They'd chase each other between thawing streams, splashing in water that still bit like ice. For a few short weeks, the world softened. The sun returned, not as warmth, but as a memory of warmth, and the tribe would move north again, following the herds, the fire, the endless white horizon. It's strange, isn't it, to think that every human alive today descends from those children, those fragile, frost-bitten survivors who learned to smile in the face of the endless cold. Their blood runs in ours, their instincts buried somewhere deep beneath our comforts. When we feel the first bite of winter and pull our coats tighter, it is, in some distant sense, their memory a whisper from an age when warmth was sacred and survival itself was an act of quiet defiance. And so the story of the children of the cold is not one of tragedy, but of persistence. Their lives were short, their world unforgiving, yet they carried humanity through the darkest winters. They were the small lights that flickered against the vast white silence, fragile, fleeting, and utterly extraordinary. There are rivers that no longer flow. Once, They carved their way through the heart of the Ice Age world, veins of meltwater threading through a landscape that barely knew warmth. Now they lie buried, trapped beneath layers of earth and memory, their paths sealed in ice and silence. To the ancient hunters, these frozen rivers were both a guide and a warning. They promised life when they thawed, and death when they froze. And yet, in their stillness, they carried something more, a kind of ancient rhythm, as if time itself had slowed to the pace of dripping water, suspended between moments that never truly ended. When you stand beside a frozen river, even today, there is a kind of illusion that takes hold. The surface looks solid, serene, a glassy stillness. But beneath it, life still stirs. Tiny bubbles of air shift slowly through the ice, forming ghostly trails that vanish into the depth. In the Ice Age, the hunters learned to listen to these sounds, the soft groan of the ice, the faint trickle beneath the surface. To them, it was a voice, low and eternal. Some believed it spoke to them. They said the rivers remembered that they carried whispers from the ancestors who had walked these lands before. When the wind quieted and the cold grew deep, you could almost hear it a pulse beneath the ice, steady and ancient, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. It's strange to imagine that water, something so ordinary to us, once held such mystery. The hunters followed these frozen veins across vast distances. They slept along their edges, built fires in the hollows of their banks. The rivers guided them like constellations carved into the land. Even in frozen form, they provided clues, the direction of cracks, the taste of the snow, the faint scent of minerals rising through thin sheets of ice. Everything meant something. A river was never just a river. It was a map, a teacher, a quiet companion in a world that spoke mostly in silence. And when the thaw finally came, it was both a blessing and a reckoning. The ice groaned and split, releasing torrents of dark, cold water that had been trapped for months, sometimes years. The hunters would stand at the edges and watch as the old rivers woke again, their surfaces breaking into shifting plates that collided with deep, echoing booms. The sound was haunting, like thunder buried underground. Some tribes believed these moments marked the passage of spirits. Freed from the ice after long imprisonment, they would leave offerings, small bones, carved stones, fragments of food, letting them drift downstream as tokens of respect. Perhaps it was superstition, or perhaps, in their own quiet way, they understood that the earth was alive and that everything frozen would one day flow again. In the modern world, when scientists drill into ancient glaciers, they sometimes find trapped pockets of air, tiny bubbles that have not breathed the open sky for tens of thousands of years. Within them are the remnants of that lost atmosphere, the same air that brushed against mammoth fur, that filled the lungs of those who hunted with spears of bone. When the ice is melted in laboratories, the air escapes with a soft hiss, a whisper from another age. Some have described the sound as unsettling, as though the past itself were exhaling. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The idea that the breath of the Ice Age still lingers, waiting to be released. There's an old hunter's tale, passed down in fragments, about a river that never thawed. They said it was cursed, that it ran backwards beneath the ice, pulling anything near it into a place where time stopped. Hunters who followed its edge too closely would vanish, their footprints ending abruptly on the frozen bank. The elders told the story to warn the young not to wander too far, but some part of it feels older than a simple cautionary tale. Maybe it was a way of explaining something they couldn't yet understand, the strange shifts of the ice, the places where sound seemed to die and light bent strangely against the surface. Even now, explorers find frozen tunnels deep beneath the ground where water flows slowly, unseen, winding through darkness like veins through stone. Some of those currents are so old that their origins can't be traced. They have been moving since before humans ever walked upright. For the ancient hunters, time was not something measured, It was something felt. The frozen rivers taught them this. The seasons didn't arrive as dates or numbers. They came as sensations. The crack of distant ice meant the end of winter. The color of the snow meant a new beginning. Each thaw brought back not just warmth, but memory of hunts, of fires, of voices that had faded months before. In the shimmering reflection of melting water, they saw both the past and the promise of survival. The river was their calendar, their storyteller. When it froze, time itself seemed to pause. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the fires low, the hunters would tell stories of what lay beneath the ice. They imagined that entire worlds existed there, forests of crystal trees, herds of glowing animals, the spirits of those who had gone before. Some believed that when they died, they would sink through the frozen rivers and awaken in those hidden lands, walking again in warmth and silence. The idea might sound fanciful now, but perhaps it wasn't so far from truth. After all, beneath the glaciers, entire landscapes still exist, preserved in darkness, untouched since the Ice Age. Rivers that flow unseen, plants sealed in time, microbes still alive after tens of millennia, waiting for the thaw. The ancients may not have known the science, but they sensed the mystery. It's almost comforting to think of those rivers as the Earth's memory, carrying fragments of every life that ever touched them. The mammoth that drank and fell through the ice. The woman who washed blood from her hands after a hunt. The child who laughed as he watched the ice break in spring. All of it carried downstream, frozen, preserved. And perhaps, if we could listen closely enough, the rivers would still tell their stories not in words, but in the slow, patient language of water and time. Today, scientists can trace those same ancient rivers by studying sediments buried deep beneath modern landscapes. Some flow beneath cities now, their paths hidden beneath layers of concrete and steel. The water still moves faint, cold, and unseen, connecting us to that age of silence. There's something humbling in that thought, that every drop of water we drink has, at some point, been part of an ancient current, frozen and thawed 1,000 times. It has touched bones, stones, and stars reflected in ice. It has carried the breath of creatures that no longer exist. The same element that once froze around the first fires of humankind now fills our cups, our oceans, our veins. And maybe that's why, even now, when we look into a frozen river, we feel something unspoken, a tug, gentle, ancient like recognition, as if part of us remembers the stillness, the waiting, the sound of distant cracks beneath the endless white. The frozen rivers of time are not just relics of nature, but mirrors reflecting who we were when the world was new, when warmth was rare, and when survival meant learning to move with the slow rhythm of the earth. Somewhere, far, beneath the snow and the centuries, those rivers still move unseen, unheard, unhurried. They carry the memory of an age that never truly ended, only slept beneath the ice. And perhaps, in the quiet spaces of our own hearts, they still whisper to us, urging us to remember what it means to endure, to wait, and to flow, even when the world stands frozen. There are stories that drift quietly through the ages, never quite vanishing, never quite explained. Among the ancient hunters of the Ice Age, there were tales of those who simply disappeared, men, women, entire hunting bands swallowed by the snow without sound or struggle. They left behind their tools, their fires, sometimes even their footprints, which ended abruptly in the middle of an untouched expanse. For centuries, such vanishings were spoken of in whispers around flickering flames, like ghostly threads woven into the fabric of their winters. In that frozen world, the line between life and disappearance was thin, barely more than a breath. A blizzard could erase a person in minutes. The white horizon swallowed everything equally, the living and the dead, the known and the forgotten. Yet there were times when even the weather couldn't explain what was left behind. camps abandoned with food still cooking, tracks that circled endlessly as if the hunter had walked in confusion before vanishing, and sometimes strange marks near the ice, long, smooth arcs, as though something vast had slid across the surface and taken them away. The elders of those tribes never spoke of monsters. Their world didn't need them. The cold itself was enough. It had its own quiet will. They said that the land could grow hungry, that it took back what it had given, and when it did, it left no trace. Some believed that the lost ones had walked too close to the edge of reality, to the places where the ice met the unknown. There, they said, the air grew thinner, the sound of the wind became distant, and shadows peered beneath the ice that did not move with the Sunday. In one such place, buried now beneath a mountain of glacial stone, there once ran a long valley of frozen mist. The hunters called it the Passage of Breaths. The air there was strange, it shimmered faintly, even in darkness, and the snow beneath one's feet sometimes emitted a low hum, as though a hidden river moved far below. It was said that those who entered the valley alone often did not return, and those who did came back changed, quieter, slower, speaking of shapes that watched from beneath the ice. They would stare into the flames at night, their eyes reflecting something distant, as if still seeing the shimmer of that valley. Today, archaeologists have unearthed strange evidence from such places. Caves deep beneath the ice with markings that seem too deliberate to be natural, yet too crude to be the work of any known tool. Small circles of stones arranged with mathematical precision, found miles apart yet sharing the same pattern. Skeletal remains buried in ways that suggest ritual not of death, but of departure. No signs of struggle, no predators, just quiet, organized absence. It's almost as if they knew they were leaving and wanted to be remembered in silence. There is a theory, whispered more among poets than scientists, that the Ice Age people had a deeper relationship with disappearance, that to vanish was not always tragedy, but transformation. The cold, in its purity, could take one beyond the boundaries of the visible. Those who walked into the storms alone might have believed they were stepping into another world, one of light and stillness, where the soul could rest. Perhaps they thought the ice was not just death, but a kind of doorway. To them, the idea of returning to the earth, preserved perfectly in its frozen embrace, was not frightening. It was natural, and yet there are signs that suggest something stranger. In one preserved site, near the edge of what is now Siberia, explorers found the remains of a small camp, 2 shelters made of mammoth bone and hide, still half buried in frost. Inside, the objects were arranged neatly: furs, tools, carved figures of animals, everything undisturbed. Except for one thing, a single handprint on the inner wall, pressed into the hardened ice. The print was too large to belong to any of the people whose bones were found nearby, and yet too human to be an animal's. The fingers were long, the palm wide, and the ice around it had melted slightly, as though something warm had touched it not long before freezing again. The scientists called it a coincidence, a trick of expansion and light. But among the locals, they still call that place the Mark of the Watcher. In another site, 1,000 miles away, a different kind of mystery was found: bones buried upright, facing north, no grave goods, no signs of violence. The placement was deliberate, almost reverent. When tested, the bones belonged to people who had lived hundreds of years apart, and yet all stood in the same direction. Some believe it was a ritual meant to honor the spirits of the frozen winds. Others think it was a way of marking something far older, a path that the living could not see but only feel, running beneath the ice, drawing them towards some ancient magnet of the earth. Even today, the tundra holds places where compasses fail, where magnetic lines twist in strange ways. Explorers report feelings of confusion, as though time slows and the horizon folds upon itself. Perhaps those sensations are no more than exhaustion, or tricks of light on endless snow, or perhaps they are remnants of the same forces that once drew the hunters into their quiet vanishings, the pull of the unknown that waits beneath the ice. It's possible that the disappearances were simply the result of human fragility, exhaustion, hunger, isolation. The ice plays tricks on the mind. When surrounded by silence for too long, even the sound of one's own heartbeat begins to echo strangely, as though it belongs to someone else. The mind begins to fill the emptiness with shapes, patterns, presences. Perhaps those ancient hunters, facing months of endless white, began to see things that weren't there until, at last, they followed them into the mist. But what if, in some way, what they saw was real? Not real in the way we define it, but in the way dreams are real while we are dreaming them. The Ice Age was a time when the boundaries between the natural and the mystical were still thin. The world itself was alive, breathing through the cracks of the glaciers, humming beneath the snow. The hunters may not have disappeared into death, but into the deep rhythm of that living earth, absorbed by it, remembered by it, becoming part of the cold itself. There's a haunting thought that lingers here, that the reason we find so many traces of the Ice Age bones, tools, footprints, yet so many unexplained absences, is because some of those people never truly left, that they are still there, frozen in the folds of time, not as ghosts but as echoes preserved in the ice. When the glaciers groan, when distant icebergs crack and release ancient air, perhaps those are not just sounds of nature but faint, forgotten voices stirring once more. And maybe, in a way, they never meant to be found. The Ice Age was a teacher of silence. It demanded stillness, patience, surrender. To vanish into its quiet vastness was, perhaps, to accept the deepest lesson it offered, that sometimes the greatest survival is to become one with the world that holds you. The hunters may have understood this. They walked into the white not to escape it, but to join it. And so, their disappearances were not losses, but returns to the endless, waiting calm that sleeps beneath every layer of ice. If you listen closely, when the wind moves over frozen valleys or through hollow glaciers, you might still hear them not as words, but as a faint hum, a vibration beneath the sound of the world. It is the song of those who disappeared, still moving softly through the cold, guiding the living across a landscape that remembers everything and forgets nothing. When the ice began to melt, it did not happen suddenly, but quietly, almost politely, as though the world itself was sighing after a very long breath. The air softened first, the wind lost its sharp edge, and then the white horizon that had stood for centuries began to darken with hints of blue, grey and brown. To the ancient hunters, this change must have seemed like magic, a slow unfreezing of time. The ground, once hard and unforgiving, began to glisten and weep. Water trickled from the edges of cliffs, gathered in small pools, and ran down into valleys that had not known motion for ages. It was as if the earth, too, was waking from a long, cold dream. At first, they didn't understand it. The ice had always been their eternal, unmoving, the backdrop of their entire existence. To see it shifting, softening, dripping away must have felt like witnessing the death of something sacred. Some tribes celebrated, believing the thaw to be a gift from the sky. Others feared it, whispering that the balance of the world had been disturbed. The melting ice revealed strange things, bones of creatures no one had seen alive, smooth stones carved by ancient hands, fragments of wood turned to black glass. The earth beneath the glaciers was not empty, it was filled with memory. Every drop of melting water carried whispers from another time. It's strange to imagine what the sound of that thaw would have been like. The constant drip of melting icicles, the groan of collapsing ice sheets, the distant roar of water rushing where it had never flowed before. The hunters would have heard the first rivers being born small at first, then growing wild, cutting paths through valleys and mountains. The ground trembled beneath their feet as ancient ice cracked apart. The air smelled of wet stone, moss, and something else, something new. Perhaps it was life itself returning, slow and hesitant, unsure if it was welcome after so long. But with the thaw came confusion. The animals began to move differently. Herds that once crossed the plains disappeared, their migration paths drowned beneath floods of meltwater. Forests began to sprout where there had been endless white. The cold-adapted beasts, the mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, the cave lions began to struggle. Their world was changing faster than they could follow. The hunters, too, had to change. Their shelters, built for the eternal cold, began to drip and sink. Their weapons, designed for creatures of ice, were useless against the quick, darting animals of the thawing lands. Some adapted, others faded away, like the ice itself. And yet, something beautiful happened in those slow centuries of melting. The world turned soft again. Colours returned, muted greens, earthy browns, golden rays of sunlight piercing through mist. Streams filled with fish that had been absent for generations. Birds returned from the south, their calls breaking the silence that had ruled for so long. Flowers grew where once there had been nothing but frost. Imagine the first person to see a meadow of colour after a lifetime of white. What must that have felt like? To see the world breathe again, to feel warmth not from fire but from the sun itself. It must have seemed like a miracle too great to name. Still, not all welcomed the change. Some hunters spoke of the ice as if it were a living being, an old guardian that had watched over them. When it melted, they felt abandoned. They called the new warmth the forgetting. They said the earth was losing its memory, that everything once preserved in the ice would vanish forever. And in a way, they were right. The melt swallowed the relics of their ancestors. Graves that had been perfectly sealed in frost were washed away by rushing streams. Cave paintings faded as dampness crept into the stone. The ice that had once preserved became the destroyer, erasing traces of all that had come before. In some of these melt zones, archaeologists have discovered strange patterns, circles of dark soil amid the lighter earth, as if great fires had burned beneath the ice long ago. Some think these were natural vents where geothermal warmth rose, creating pockets of life before the full thaw. Others suggest they were camps, the last settlements of those who refused to move south, clinging to the cold even as it left them behind. In one such site, the remains of a small fire were found, surrounded by perfectly preserved footprints in the thawed mud. The prints stopped abruptly at the edge of a slope, beyond which the ground had collapsed into meltwater. It's as if they stood there, watching the ice die, unable to decide whether to follow the warmth or remain in the cold they knew. There are legends, passed down through centuries, about the melting spirits beings who emerged from the glaciers as they thawed. They were said to be neither human nor animal, but something in between the essence of the ice itself, released into the world. They would appear at dawn or twilight, their forms shifting like water in the light. Some stories say they guided hunters to fertile lands. Others say they lured wanderers into deep waters, as if the ice were reclaiming what it had given. Perhaps these tales were simply the imagination of people trying to understand a world that was changing too fast. But perhaps, somewhere in that strangeness, there was truth the way truth hides inside dreams. As the ice retreated further, it revealed entire worlds that had been trapped beneath it. Valleys carved smooth as bone. Lakes that reflected the sky with such clarity that one couldn't tell where water ended and air began. And scattered across these new lands were the bones of creatures long gone, frozen in mid-motion, as though time itself had stopped them. Some were found still standing, their eyes sealed in frost, their fur untouched by decay. For the hunters who found them, it must have felt as if they had discovered the ghosts of their own pasts, caught forever between life and death. What's most haunting about this age is that it was both an ending and a beginning. The melting of the ice marked the death of one world and the birth of another. Those who lived through it carried both in their memory the silence of the old, the sound of the new. They told stories of the days when rivers returned, when the frozen sky began to drip, when the first thunder echoed through valleys that had never known rain. Some said that the melting ice whispered as it vanished, releasing the voices of those it had kept frozen for millennia. The streams carried those voices southward, into the soil, into the roots of trees, into the oceans, into us. In the end, the hunters adapted. They followed the rivers, built new shelters, learned to live in the warmth. The old ways faded like footprints in thawing snow, but even as they moved forward, they carried a quiet sorrow, a longing for the stillness they had lost. Perhaps that's why, even today, we find beauty in the cold, in snow falling against the window, in the hush of a frozen night. Somewhere deep within us, a memory of the ice still lingers, a whisper of the world as it once was, slow and silent and endlessly white. And so, when the ice began to melt, it did not simply change the land, it changed the people, the animals, the air itself. It reshaped memory. The world learned to move again, to breathe, to flow. But beneath every green field and flowing river, the ghosts of that frozen age remain, preserved in layers of earth and water. The thaw may have freed the world, but it also left behind a secret that the ice never truly left. It waits, deep, below, quiet and eternal, holding the breath of a time when the world stood still, and the cold was a kind of love. Even after the great thaw, when the green had returned and the rivers ran freely, the snow never truly disappeared. It lingered in the high places on the silent peaks, in the deep folds of the earth, as if unwilling to let go of its ancient dominion. There, where the wind still whispered through hollow valleys, the echoes of the frozen world could still be heard. They weren't loud or frightening, just soft murmurs carried by the cold air, a reminder of a time when everything was still and the world was made of quiet. The people who came after the hunters would sometimes speak of strange sounds that rose from beneath the snow. On still nights, when the wind stopped and the stars hung motionless, they said you could hear faint drumming, not thunder, but something slower, older, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. No one could say for certain what it was. Some thought it was the shifting of buried ice, deep beneath the soil. Others said it was the breath of those who had come before, caught between the layers of frozen time. Whatever it was, it seemed to remind everyone that the past was never truly gone, only sleeping beneath the white. In the northern lands, travellers would find small mounds of snow that never melted, no matter how many summers passed. Beneath those mounds, they discovered strange patterns in the soil spirals of ash, blackened circles where nothing grew. Some believed they were the remains of ancient fires, the last embers of the Ice Age hunters who had vanished into the thaw. Others thought they marked something deeper, places where memory itself had sunk into the ground, crystallized, waiting to be remembered. When the wind blew across those mounds, it carried a hollow, almost musical tone, as if the snow were singing softly to itself. There are stories, quiet ones, about travelers who camped too close to such places. They would wake in the middle of the night, hearing footsteps crunching softly around their tents. But when they looked outside, there was nothing, only fresh snow, unmarked and perfect. In the morning, they would find small shapes pressed into the ice, like the prints of ancient tools, or the curve of a hand resting gently on the surface. One story tells of a man who followed the sound of faint humming through a snowstorm. He said it led him to a hollow where the ground glowed faintly blue, as though a piece of the ancient ice still breathed beneath. When he returned, His hair had turned pale as frost, and he spoke of voices that whispered in a language no one understood, a language that sounded less like words and more like wind. The scientists who later studied the permafrost found strange phenomena too. In certain places, when they drilled into the ice, they recorded low frequencies, soft, rhythmic vibrations that seemed to pulse from below. Some said it was geological movement, others weren't so sure. One researcher wrote that when she placed her hand against the frozen ground, she could feel a faint, uneven rhythm, like something asleep, dreaming under layers of time. She described it as the earth remembering itself. Her colleagues laughed at the phrasing, but her words stayed with them, lingering like a quiet echo at the edge of understanding. Sometimes, the thaw would reveal fragments, bones polished smooth by centuries of ice, or carved stones with strange markings. The carvings were never clear, lines curved like rivers, circles that faded into one another. They didn't tell stories in the way later people did. They seemed instead to describe patterns, maybe of stars, or winds, or time itself. Some believed these markings were not messages meant for others, but for the earth, a conversation between the living and the frozen, left behind in silence. It's comforting, in a way, to think that the snow holds memory, that somewhere beneath the cold layers, the footsteps of those who came before still exist, not erased, just hidden. When you walk across a quiet field in winter, hearing the soft crunch beneath your boots, you are treading upon centuries. The snow that falls today is not new. It has fallen before, countless times in endless cycles. Each flake, each drift, carries fragments of all that has ever been the breath of animals long gone, the smoke of ancient fires, the sigh of melting glaciers. The air itself is a kind of archive, patient and eternal. In certain remote valleys, explorers have described seeing faint lights under the snow, not reflections, not fire, but soft, shimmering glows that move like thoughts. Some think it's trapped gases or minerals reacting with temperature shifts. Others, though, prefer to imagine it differently. They say it's the soul of the ice, glowing gently from within, reminding the living that beauty does not vanish, it only changes form. These lights, when they appear, are never bright. They flicker just at the edge of vision, like the memory of a dream that refuses to fade completely. When night falls on a snowy landscape, the silence is unlike any other. Sound becomes slow, almost heavy. Even your own breath feels distant, as though you are listening to someone else breathe. The stars reflect faintly off the snow, turning the ground into a mirror for the sky. In such moments, one can feel the presence of the old world not as something dead, but as something that waits. The frozen earth feels alive in its stillness, as if beneath that quiet surface, it is thinking, remembering, listening. There's a strange peace in that thought that the past never truly ends. It simply changes texture. It becomes part of the soil, the wind, the snow. Perhaps that's why so many people find calm in the cold. Beneath the harshness, there's something profoundly gentle. The snow does not judge or hurry. It covers all, things equally, the ruins, the bones, the sleeping seeds. It hides the scars of time, but never destroys them. It waits, patient and kind, until the world is ready to remember again. And so, as the last chapter of the Ice Age closed, the echoes beneath the snow continued. They are still there now, faint and almost forgotten, but not gone. If you ever stand alone in the stillness of winter, you might hear them too, a soft murmur beneath your feet, a distant hum in the cold air. It's not imagination. It's the sound of history breathing quietly just beneath the surface. The sound of everything that ever was, waiting for someone to listen. Perhaps that's what makes winter so peaceful. It holds all the voices that once were, frozen into silence, whispering softly through time. Each flake of snow that lands on your sleeve carries a memory, unseen but real, of an age when people walked on ice, when the sky was white and endless, when the earth itself slept beneath a blanket of cold. And when the snow melts, those memories return to the air, joining the endless cycle once more. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the world long ago, quiet, vast, and endless beneath the snow. Hear the faint echoes beneath it, the soft hum of the frozen earth. Let it remind you that time moves slowly, and that even in silence, there are stories still being told. Sleep, knowing that the world remembers through wind, through water, through snow. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle, like the whispers beneath the frost.